So I want to tell you this joke, and hopefully I can do it without messing it up. And it's a joke, but it really is a serious thing, and it's something that applies to life. And that is the reason why I'm telling you this. There was a taxi cab driver, and there was a pastor, and they both go to heaven, and they get up to St. Peter's Gate. And the taxi driver goes in first, and he goes and he says, "Okay, I'm ready to go to heaven." St. Peter says, "Okay," looks at his chart, says, "Okay," opens the gates and rolls out this carpet, puts a crown on his head. The angels start singing beautiful melody, and the trumpets start playing, and it's just a glorious occasion, and he walks through. And the pastor's like, "Wow, if he gets that, imagine what I'm going to get. I was a pastor, and he was a taxi cab driver." So the pastor gets up there, and he says, "Okay, I'm ready to go to heaven." He looks at his chart, and he opens the doors, or opens the gates, and says, "Go ahead and go in." He said, Wait a minute. I was a pastor. He was a taxi cab driver. Look what all he got. Why am I only getting this?" And St. Peter says, "Well, let me explain this to you. When the taxi cab driver drove those people, when they got into his taxi, his driving was so horrible that them people was praying, and they was praying for their life, and they was praying to God, "God, help me." He says, when they come to your church and you was telling your sermons, people was falling asleep. They wasn't listening to anything you had to say. So let me go on to clarify some more. It's a truth in life. No matter what position you're holding, does not mean that you're automatically going to make it to heaven. You can be a pastor on a pulpit, and you might not make it to heaven because your heart ain't right. And a person who's not in a pulpit, who doesn't preach, everyday Joe, you might not think is going to heaven, but he might just make it to heaven before the pastor. Now, I used to work as a CNA in the medical field for about 10 years. I worked in nursing homes. And anybody who has worked in that field has witnessed when people pass on. And there's a thing that happens in almost every case when somebody passes on. There are two ways this goes. One, they start speaking in a tongue that nobody's ever heard of and don't understand, and they're talking to somebody. They will stare off into a corner, and they'll be smiling and carrying on this conversation. I believe in the heavenly language, right? And they're excited and they're ready to go. And sometimes they even meet up with a loved one who is going to take their hand, and they're ready to go. Or they are meeting someone, they're seeing someone who's not so friendly and scary, and they become extremely fearful and fighting for their lives. "Please, no, don't take me. I don't want to go with you. Leave me alone." And they're kicking and they're screaming and they're punching, and they don't want to go with this person. And I'm guessing that they ain't going to heaven. Now, I've experienced this with all kinds of people. But one that really surprised me was a pastor one time that I took care of. And he was a pastor. You just automatically assumed he was going to heaven. But he met with some people that I do not believe were taking him to heaven. And he was swinging and he was kicking and he was mad. And he's like, no, I don't want to go with you. Leave me alone. And he was fighting for his life. And then he passed. Now, you don't automatically get to heaven because you're in a pulpit and you teach the word. A lot of people know the word. Devil knows the word. Devil knows the Bible better than we do. It's where your heart is. Sometimes a pastor will put the church building itself above, on an altar above God. Sometimes he'll put the audience on an altar above God. Sometimes he puts himself on an altar before God. Not always. I'm just saying, sometimes this is the case. Just like in everyday life, sometimes we put our marriage on an altar before God, or our children on an altar before God, or our friends on an altar before God, or a job on an altar before God. It is easy to get off the path. It's easy to get sidetracked because that path is a narrow path. The gate is narrow. It says that in the Bible. A lot of times people will put their money above God on an altar. I've seen that time and time again. And as a pastor, to check myself, I'm always asking God, as often, probably more often than you know or think, to check my heart motives. Am I doing things the way you want me to do them, God? Am I getting out of your will? Am I putting anything on the altar that I should not be putting on an altar? Am I putting anything before you? Am I making this about me or making this about you? Because I don't ever want to get out of God's will. I've witnessed what it's like to be out of God's will. And I actually was just talking to another pastor on a page that was about this, which made me want to do this. And it's easy to get sidetracked and get off the narrow path. And that's the devil's always tempting us. Sometimes we get caught up in life, and it's very easy to go off the path. So we have to constantly check ourselves, whether you're on a pulpit or you're walking everyday life. We have to check ourselves, because just because you're a Christian don't mean you're automatically going to make it to heaven. If you get off the path, that gate's narrow. You get off the path, you got to get back on the path. You got to be checking yourself all the time so you don't get off that path. Just because you're a pastor and you teach the word in a church or on a pulpit or on social media don't mean you're automatically going to heaven. It don't. Sometimes you get off the path. We always got to make sure we're putting God first and foremost and be checking ourselves. I mean, God usually lets us know, but we don't always hear it. We don't always want to hear it. Sometimes we got so much going on, it gets quieted. His voice gets quieted and we don't hear it. So it's very important to stay on that path. And we're all falling short of perfection. The only one who falls into that realm of perfection is Jesus. He's the only one worthy. And so we struggle with that, and we have to constantly make sure that we are on that path and that we're not getting sidetracked and we're not getting off. We're not putting anything as an altar in front of him. You know, sometimes the economy gets hard and money gets tight, and then we start worrying about how we're going to make those bills, and so we start putting in extra time at a job that we put before God. I've been guilty of that. I've been guilty of that. And I had to be corrected by my God. And so you have to make sure that you're putting God first. It's really easy to put things before him, and nothing should ever be before him. So always check yourself, because none of us are perfect, and that gate is narrow, and we want to go through that gate, baby. We want to. So always check yourself. It's not a bad thing to do. Hallelujah.